Over the years, I've attended many meetings. Must be many hundreds, even thousands. Of course, these have varied hugely as to what sort of meeting they were. Sometimes they would have been elders' meetings, where we would be discussing matters to do with the government and leadership of the church. On other occasions, maybe trustees' meetings, which looks after the legal side and the financial side of a charity, and very often that would be a church as well. Sometimes there have been meetings with Terry and his apostolic team, the leadership of New Frontiers, the family of churches around the world. And then of course there'll be other meetings, such as planning meetings for conferences and so on. And through the attendance of these meetings and sometimes chairing them, I've learned a number of things that can be helpful to make a meeting flow better, can make a meeting more efficient, so that when you come out of the meeting, you don't think, what was all that about? Have we really achieved anything? Did we make some good decisions? Who's taking the actions? Who's going to implement those decisions? And so this session is about some very down-to-earth, nitty-gritty stuff. Some practicalities about agendas and minutes, and even how to chair a meeting most effectively. So let's start by just considering some of the different sorts of meetings that there are. First of all, you get the kind of one-off informal meeting. Perhaps you want to meet with a colleague to discuss a certain matter, to get his opinion, to get her opinion. And you go away feeling, okay, I now understand more about the circumstances, but that's not a meeting that you would bother to take minutes in, or even necessarily make a particular record. It's achieved its purpose. You knew why you were gathering, and once you've had your discussion and are both comfortable with the conclusion you've reached, you part. Then next you might have a meeting that is one of a series of meetings. Over the years, I've been involved in planning many conferences. And so there is a series of meetings that takes place through the year. Quite often, the conference would be an annual conference, something like the Stoneleigh Bible Week, where we used to gather tens of thousands of people, or a leadership conference where we might gather just a few thousand. But these were annual events. And it was, of course, necessary to hold meetings, to plan and to make sure everything was in place before the delegates turned up, to invite the speakers, to make sure everyone was registered and had paid the fee and so on. And so in that case, we'd have a series of meetings, very often scheduled throughout the year, that would be addressing particular issues at particular times of the year. So at the beginning of the year, we'd be laying a foundation for the meeting, and as we came closer to the conference, so we'd be refining some of the practicalities of how to welcome people, things like the handbook and other matters to do with registration. And then there are certain meetings that are what you might call business meetings. Now, in different countries, you'll have to deal with these in different ways, but certainly in my home country, the United Kingdom, a church has to be a charity, and a charity has to observe certain legal issues. This means that any meeting has to be minuted so that it can be looked back on afterwards, and if there is a problem, you can work out how the decision was made, why it was made, who was at the meeting, and so on. And that's also true with finance. Finance has to be very thoroughly kept and recorded. That's part of good stewardship in the kingdom anyhow. But we have to observe certain legal practices as we prepare our finances, not only in the recording of them, but every year carrying out an audit. So a meeting of trustees of that charity is quite a formal affair. We will have certain decisions that we have to make and have to make a record of. And we have to be sure that everyone is happy, or we record the people who have agreed with that decision. And then, of course, there are elders' meetings. Now, that is to do with the government of the church, And the elders are, of course, seen as those who are running and leading the church. So the trustees work with them, working hand in hand, making sure that the legal requirements are being observed, while the elders are giving the spiritual leadership that will take the church towards accomplishing the vision that is being pursued. Other meetings would be Terry's apostolic team. I worked for many years with Terry Virgo, the founder and father of the New Frontiers family of churches, and we would meet quite regularly through the year, but because they were international meetings with people flying in from other nations, these meetings would tend to go on over 2 or 3 days, so that we were making the best use of the time. Now, I would be responsible for setting up those meetings in practical terms. I would negotiate with a hotel or with a conference centre. I would need to make sure that all the practicalities of the comfort of the room were in place. And then I would take the minutes throughout that meeting. Minutes on a 3-day meeting can be quite extensive. So it may be that you register with some of these meetings yourselves in your own situation. And so I'm going to share with you some very practical matters here about agendas, about minutes, and towards the latter part of this talk about how to chair a meeting, because that in itself is a skill and contributes in a major way to how successful the meeting will be. And meetings may of course be quite short. They may be just half an hour or so, or they can be quite long, such as the one I've just mentioned, the 3-day meeting. So let's look first of all at some of the practicalities of setting up a meeting. First of all, where is it going to be held and on what date and time? There's nothing more infuriating than half of the members of a particular meeting arriving on time and the other half arriving late saying, "Oh, I thought it was going to be at such and such a time." Or I've even known occasions where most people have turned up at one venue and you get a phone call from someone saying, "Where are you all?" And you find that they've gone to the wrong venue. So these things sound obvious, but it is important that everyone knows where the meeting's being held and what time. And although I know time in different cultures is looked on in different ways, I do feel that for a meeting that involves maybe 6 or 8 people, it is important that everyone arrives on time, ready to start. Because although the missing people, when they turn up, won't necessarily be made to feel unfriendly, and those who have arrived on time, they will be talking to one another, the bottom line is that people are busy and they need to be accountable for their time. And so if a meeting is going to start, say, at 8 o'clock in the evening, make sure it does start at that time and not at 8:30. Because for 8 people, if the meeting's supposed to start at 8 o'clock and it actually starts at 8:30, well, you've lost 4 hours. That's 8 times half an hour. And I believe that that's not actually an example of excellence, which I believe is what God would always have us to pursue. The next is the environment. A meeting needs to be in a place that is comfortable to sit in. It needs to be in a place where there's sufficient light. Just the comfort of people, the chairs, are they comfortable? Now, depending on the sort of meeting, you can have different layouts. Sometimes it can be quite formal and the people will meet around a table. That's good for a business meeting, and perhaps for up to 2 hours. People will sit at a table, any papers they may have can be laid out in front of them. But for a meeting that goes on for 3 days, that is not so comfortable. You get quite stiff and you start to wriggle around in the chair. And so I've found that semi-easy chairs, not a really comfortable sofa, that just makes people go to sleep, but something that's a little lower can be quite helpful, so they can recline in it slightly. The meetings tend to be more of a discussion nature, so people having a conversation than being very sharp and keeping to a particular agenda. And it's still helpful to have somewhere to put your papers, so I find some low tables can be helpful on that occasion. And of course, don't forget to have glasses of water and so on available to people, so that they can just get up and stretch and walk over to the side perhaps and get a glass of water, even while a conversation is going on. That's in a more relaxed, extended meeting. And then for the short meeting, if you want to make that really short and efficient, don't sit down at all. Meet in a corridor, meet in the open air, meet in someone's office, but don't sit down. If people sit, they relax, and it takes longer. Now, this will be very strange to cultures where relationship is held so high, and that's a great value. But sometimes it gets in the way of just making a meeting effective. So there are times when a short, sharp meeting, it serves both parties or the number of people who are there. And then, of course, prayer. It's very easy to go into a business meeting and think, well, this is about business. This is nothing to do with God. This is nothing to do with prayer. No, 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 no. We are here to extend the kingdom of God, and everything we do should honor Him. And how can we have a good discussion and make good decisions without involving the Holy Spirit? We really want to ask Him to come and help us and to guide our thoughts, to guide our expectations, to guide our relationships. Yes, there are times when meetings can begin to become just a little bit tense. Maybe one person has a disagreement with another. And that's where it needs real grace from the Holy Spirit. So let's pray. And to be honest, some of the most effective meetings I've been in over the years have allowed an extensive time of prayer, particularly in those 3-day meetings. Well, we would pray for 1 to 2 hours every day before the meeting gets going. And through that, you get prophetic impartation. You get clear direction from God. Sometimes you'd even get little kind of prophetic conversations going on, and you find that when you get to the agenda, well, you've already done the business, because God has helped you come to that place of understanding, that place of being together before Him. You don't worry in those settings about who is chairing the meeting or anything like that. Let the Holy Spirit do the chairing. So I'd say prayer is very important. And even in the shorter meetings, like trustees' meetings, I will always open with prayer. And then there's the matter of the status of the meeting. As I mentioned a little earlier, some meetings have some legal status, and so it's important that you make sure you're covering the necessary legal points. In a trustees meeting in the United Kingdom, we would have a company secretary. That sounds very formal, doesn't it? But a charitable trust in my country can be either a charitable trust or actually a charitable company. And if it's a charitable company, you have a company secretary. And that actually is the favoured model. It carries a lot that is beneficial. But we won't go into that now. That's not relevant for this particular presentation. And then, what are the expected outcomes? Why have you come together at all? It's really important that everyone at that meeting has a clear understanding of what the expectation is. We'll talk more about this later, but it really is very important that people know why they've come together. That they don't come into a room because the elders always meet, say, once a week, without having any idea what you're going to talk about this time. Now, you need to give people an advance warning of what the expected outcomes are. It gives a chance for people to prepare. It gives a chance for people to pray. And so don't just play it off the cuff, as we would say, but be prepared and make sure everyone knows why you're meeting. So let's look at some of the practicalities of how to make a meeting effective. First of all, an agenda. This sounds very formal, doesn't it? But it really is very, very helpful. We will touch on this in some depth, and when I'm talking about chairing a meeting, we'll also talk about it a little bit there. But an agenda is essentially laying out in front of everyone what it is that you're expecting to do over the next 2 hours or however long you're gathering together. And it gives people a chance to track the progress of the meeting. They know where they've got to. It gives everyone a chance to realise that we're taking too long over such and such a matter. We need to move on. Next, minutes. Well, minutes are quite simply notes of the meeting. They're not a full record, as in this person said this and this person said that, but are an adequate record of the meeting so that when everyone leaves the room and the minutes are typically sent to them afterwards, they can recall what happened at that meeting. I like to feel there's enough in the minutes to help people to recall the argument that got to a decision, and it's very clear who is going to take action if a decision was made that requires some action. So we're going to talk about that as well. And then the action list itself, that is not formally a part of the minutes but is attached to the minutes so that it brings together all the actions any individual is being asked to do. We'll have a look at those a little bit later. So as we go into the matter of agendas then, there are a number of matters to consider here too. First of all, is it a one-off meeting? Is it a meeting that is going to take place regularly? Because if it is, if it's a repeated meeting, sometimes there are matters on an agenda that will always be there. It's what you might call a rolling agenda. On other occasions, a rolling agenda can be interpreted as, well, we've got a list of 12 things, we'll take 8 of them now, and the next 4 will go on to the next agenda, and we'll have added a few more items to those 4. So that it's kind of rolling and continuous. It's, if you like, an extended meeting, which only formally comes together on just a number of occasions. The advantage of knowing which sort of meeting it is that if there is something that's repeated, and we'll talk in a moment about the presentation, for instance, of management accounts, it's helpful to have it in a format that people readily recognize. So that if you hand out a piece of paper with information on it, it's carrying the same sort of information as we talked about last time, and you don't have to explain the structure of the document. That's just one benefit of knowing whether you're going to be repeating this sort of meeting. It means that you prepare in a slightly different way and maybe make it more efficient. Then an agenda, of course, has certain items on it, and we have to know what those items are, how they're being gathered. Are you going to send a note out to all the members of the meeting asking whether they want something to put on there? Or is it a matter of the chairman or whoever is responsible for the meeting to define the items that go on the agenda? And then ordering those items. If you write a list of things we need to talk about at this meeting, you'll start with number 1 and number 2 and number 3. And what you're doing is writing down a list in just historical order. The top one came first. But that's not necessarily the order in which you want to actually handle the item once it gets onto the agenda. So having got your list of 6 or 8 items, have a look at them and see, well, this one needs to come first and this one's going to take a substantial amount of time, so we need to put that in quite early. And then these things are comparatively trivial and so are probably better dealt with at the end of the meeting where maybe people aren't as fresh in discussion as they would be at the beginning and so on. So it's worth just thinking about each of the items and deciding how it's going to be discussed and where it should go on the agenda. So let's have a look at an agenda, and first of all at the structure of the agenda. At the top there you'll see that I've called it a demonstration trustees meeting. I've picked a date of October the 10th 2013, and I've said that it's going to be held in friendly venue from 8 to 10 p.m. So the agenda, which really needs to be sent to all the members of the meeting in advance, it tells people immediately the place, the time, how long the meeting is expected to go on for, and so on. And so that's the heading for the agenda. Then next, well, what are the items or topics that are going to be discussed? And you'll see there that I've got 4 columns on this particular presentation. And so this is the main column, which is second from the left, but it feels like the central column. It's the one that dominates the piece of paper on which it's written, or the computer screen if people are putting it up on screen. And so it's those topics that we are ordering, and you'll see there, for instance, that the first item is a matter of taking the minutes, looking at the minutes from the previous meeting. Why do we do that? Well, in a more formal meeting, like a trustees meeting, you have to get the agreement of all the members there that the record of the minutes that were written for the last meeting are accurate. It could be in extreme circumstances that one day they are in a court of law having to defend those minutes if something goes seriously wrong. And it's no good standing there saying, well, I don't think that was an accurate minute. I don't think that was well recorded. No, through this mechanism, you are formally agreeing the minutes, and the chairman will then sign them and date them, and they become a legal document. Very important that we get this right. And then you'll see that the next item is the actions arising out of those minutes. And so here we've got an accountability coming in. We'll say a little bit more about actions later, but the reason for putting them there is that you've just checked the minutes. Maybe people have scanned them again to refresh their memories. And so it's now the right time to say, well, such and such a person, did you do that? We agreed such and such an action. Did you do it? And this person needs to be able to report back on the fact that they have indeed carried out the action that everyone agreed, and maybe give a little report on the consequences if that's relevant. And then we've got other matters on the agenda there that we can come on to at a later stage. But just to say that finance always needs to be high up on a trustees meeting. In this case, management accounts and budgeting, and then matter about buildings and so on. And so this is a typical agenda that we would have at a trustees meeting. Things like the minutes, the actions, finance will always be there. Further down the list, you'll see staff. We will always have staff on our trustees agenda. And because we want to know, are the staff doing well? Are there any changes in staff that are being made? Is a part-time member of staff becoming a full-time member? Now, these are decisions that typically will be made by the elders, but it's important that the trustees are aware of them, because ultimately the trustees are legally responsible for employing them if they are paid members of staff. And so it's important that any decisions that the elders are making are formally seen as recommendations, and that the trustees then approve them. It's then recorded in the minutes and so on. And so do you see that I'm wanting to stress the importance of getting the legal aspects right where that is relevant. But we're looking at the structure of agenda. So what's the next item? Well, the next column across I've headed person. And remembering that these agendas will be sent out to people in advance, this gives warning to someone that if I'm chairing the meeting, I'm expecting that person to introduce that topic. Because it may be that there's some preparation needed. If he or she sees that on the agenda there is a certain item that he carries responsibility for, he may need to go and ask some questions of other people involved. Maybe it's to do with a ministry, maybe it's to do with an event. He may need to brief himself so that when it comes up at the trustees meeting, he is absolutely on top of all the necessary information. He's not saying, oh, do you know, I don't really know, I need to catch up with someone on that. That then delays it to the next trustees meeting. Or maybe he makes a phone call in the middle of the meeting. Everyone then is just waiting for an answer. So this gives a chance for that person not to be caught out, to come prepared with whatever is necessary to serve that meeting. Then the next column across is called purpose. And that quite simply is giving people a chance to know, well, why is this item on the agenda at all? Is it there because a decision is needed? Is it there because an action needs to be taken? Is it there just for information? It's good just to have a list there of why each of those items is on the agenda. So you'll see on this particular agenda, in one or two cases, I've put action. So in other words, that we are looking for a report on an action or for an action to be taken. So in the case of the minutes, of course, the action is to sign them off. And then you might have something that's just an update to do with the management accounts. It's just putting the trustees in the picture with how the finances of the church are progressing through the year. Are we on target with the budget? Is the income to the level we expected? Because these sorts of things will help the elders and those who are preaching to be able to pastor and shepherd their people. If the giving is down, well, why is that? Is it that some are really suffering and going through some difficulties and are not able to come with a regular Sunday contribution? There may be other matters. And then, of course, it looks at the finances for the whole church and sees whether there's over-expenditure somewhere, whether some ministry is using more finance than was budgeted at the beginning of the year. And so this is just a way of taking the pulse of the finances. We'll be talking about finances in another talk, but if management accounts are well presented, this is not a very time-consuming item on the agenda. You might think it is, but if they're well presented, you can actually deal with it in 5 to 10 minutes. If they're badly presented, you then need a lot of explanation and so on. And so it's important that they're well prepared. And then on this item, we also had budget for the coming year. Any preparation work needed for that? Adjustments to the budget compared to the current year and so on. A budget is always a best guess. You're trying to look forward. You're trying to discern what God wants you to do in the coming year. How much will it cost? Write it down, put it together perhaps on a spreadsheet, and then look at it. And it's the trustees who have to approve that budget so that, again, legally, they're taking their responsibility. So that's an example of purpose there. It's an update. And then there's an item further down where I've put discuss. So the whole purpose of it on the agenda is purely to have a discussion. It's to bring people up to speed and to bring them into the picture and then to get their opinions. It may be part of an ongoing process. And there are certain times when it's helpful to get everyone just to discuss it, so that you're getting a view from the different members of the trustees. Because the trustee body is typically a gathering of people with specialist skills. Someone may be an accountant, someone may be a lawyer, someone may be an expert in building, an architect or someone like this. And it's an opportunity to hold a discussion on different matters and to get their opinions so that we're tapping in on all that is available to us through the gifting God has given in the church. The final column I've headed as time. Now this is a column that is relevant only for the chairman and it does not go out on the agenda in advance. This is a guide for the chairman to be able to monitor the progress of the meeting. He thinks in advance, how long is such and such an item going to take? How much time have we got for the whole meeting? Right, I need to be able to lead the meeting so that within 5 minutes, 10 minutes, 15 minutes, we've achieved the outcome that is sought so that we can move on. The danger with not doing this is that you tend to take too much time at the beginning of the meeting and then the items at the end all get squeezed into the last few minutes and they're not really given the attention that they deserve. And so this is a helpful guide. I write down literally the time I expect to find on my watch. 8 o'clock, 5 past 8, 10 past 8 and so on. So that by the time you get to the end of the meeting, you get to AOB, any other business, as the final item, and I've allowed 5 minutes for it. Hopefully there's nothing, because if anyone's got anything under AOB, they should really have told me in advance. But I'll still put it there in case there's a pressing matter we just need to deal with. So, what is the next important aid to effectiveness? Well, it's the minutes. That's the record of the meeting once it has taken place. Let's have a look at some typical minutes. Here we have at the top the previous minutes, that's the item, that they were agreed and signed. And then we move on to the second item on the agenda, and you'll notice that that is there, and we've got that as the an action from the last meeting and a report. And so once again, let's just look at the headings and describe what they're all about. The main minute is in the central column. Now, if you'll notice, this is actually laid out as a table. This is something that's readily available on an office package with a computer. And I like to use a 3-column table for taking minutes. The columns here are clearly identified: item, number on the left, the minutes in the central column, and then the initials of the person who is going to be taking the action are recorded on the right-hand side. The table itself, the grid lines do not have to show. So although when I'm taking the minutes, if that is my job, I will leave the grid lines there just so that I know where I am on the bit of paper, once the minutes are written, you can knock back the grid lines and it just looks like text on a piece of paper. And it gives a really nice clean presentation. Why do I use a table? Well, not only does it give an easy format with 3 columns readily available, but sometimes, particularly on the longer meetings, you'll find that a particular item may be dealt with on day 1 to some extent, then you move on for some reason. Then you come back to it on day 2. And it allows you to take that row out of the table, cut it and paste it into the minutes next door to the discussion that took place earlier. So that the minutes aren't a chronological record, they are a record of all that took place in terms of topic and decision making. And so to put them in a different order doesn't matter. It may be helpful to say at this point we broke and then pick it up again just as a reminder to the people who are reading, but it doesn't matter reordering it. And by putting it, taking a whole row like that out of a table and putting it somewhere else, you take any action initials that have already been put in the right-hand column. So that when you've written a minute in the left-hand column and put action initials in the right-hand column for a member of the group, then if you cut it out and put it elsewhere, it takes all of that information with it. And I just find that that makes it very easy to handle from an administrative point of view. And in this case, I speak as an administrator, one who is taking minutes, one who's seeking to record accurately what went on in the meeting, to help people recall and to know what action they're expected to take and why. And so you have that action column on the right with the initials. Then next, every item has to have a heading. And so the broad heading here you'll see is 2 actions, and then under that 2.1 alpha course. And so here there is a clear highlighting of the topic that is being discussed in the next minute. And notice how I lay it out with quite a lot of space. I don't make it very tight. Quite simply, I just find that more pleasing to the eye, but easier to access. If you're thumbing through some pages, it's easier to spot particular items if your paper bill allows that to happen. And just notice that in this case I put alpha course and I've got another number in brackets. Well, that number refers to the previous minutes. So if it was item 3.2 on the previous minutes, it becomes very easy just to refer back to those minutes from these ones. And so you've got this relationship that carries across successive meetings. Then let's just move down to the bottom of this particular cell on the table, this box on the table. And we've got there the action to be taken that Mark, is to investigate a particular matter that's discussed above, and then over on the right-hand side are Mark's initials. And so it's very clear what the minute is. There's the discussion there that's taken place, that who's meant to be taking the action, and then there's a reminder, initials on the right. Now, minutes are not there to be read like a book. They're there to be easily accessible. And so don't feel that a minute has to be written as a nice piece of prose that will get a literature prize. No, it can be short and sharp. You can leave words out as long as the meeting's clear. And also you can use, say, bullet points just to differentiate different aspects of the discussion that it might be helpful to do. If you just have sentences all packed together in one paragraph, it can be quite difficult to read and to access. And so I find that using bullet points is just a very easy way of moving on to the next little bit of the discussion, and then a brief sentence which may not be a full sentence, it may not have all the verbs and nouns and things that a sentence should have, but it's carrying information. And that's all that we're seeking to do, is to carry an accurate record with information. So there's an example of the minutes, but let's see how that is actually presented in the final document. So here we have a piece of paper that I've laid out with the various tables. You can see them clearly there. You'll see there's one box at the top, and then there's a little table underneath it, and then another table and a table at the bottom. Now we're going to go straight to the middle substantial one, because that is what we've just been looking at. Essentially we would be bringing those minutes forward, and that's where we would put them. So that you've got the item on the left, the body of the minute, and the action. And so the next box is the one at the top that tells you about the title of the meeting. Very important that people know that this is the demonstration trustees meeting. It tells you where the meeting was held. That can be a helpful memory jogger if you attend lots of meetings. Sometimes I look at some minutes and I think, I can't remember much about that discussion. Then you find it was at such and such a venue, and you think, oh yes, I remember. Oh yes, we were sitting around a table and I remember us holding it. And it just helps you to recall the discussion. And then the time, and particularly the date, is important as well, so that it is clearly dated when this meeting was held. The time is not so critical. And then under that you'll find I've written present and names. Well, who was at this meeting? That's particularly important because they're the ones who are responsible for the decisions that were made. You sometimes find under that apologies for absence, because if there are some people who are normally at the meeting who were not there on this occasion, it's good to record the fact that they were absent, so that in event of there being some need for them to be accountable, they can say, well, to be honest, I wasn't actually present in that discussion, so I'm not party to the decision. And it kind of releases them from the onus, from the weight, from the responsibility of a particular decision. We now go on to the topics discussed. Now this is quite simply, as it were, an agenda that is retrospective. I find this is a very helpful thing to do, because when you're looking back through several meetings thinking, I'm sure we talked about this topic sometime, now was it in May, was it in June? By putting it into that topics discussed, you don't have to turn over lots of pages to look for the minute that you're referring to until you find the meeting where it was discussed. Then you know you're at the right meeting, and you can then turn to the particular minute that is recalling the discussion. And under topics discussed, I put the number of the item and then just the heading beside it. We'll have a look at that in just a few moments. And then we go down to the bottom of the page where we have the actions. Now these are not part of the minutes, and you'll notice that just above the word actions it says page break. So quite deliberately I put that in so that the actions are kept separately. They're not formally a part of the minutes. The initials are there as the minute, but the actions are not. The actions presented in this form are literally to just help people remember what they've got to do. And they're grouped together under a particular person's name. So you've got the name of the person, and then item 2.3 and 4.5 and 6.2 with just a very brief summary of what the action is that is needed. And over on the right hand side there, you'll find I put a column which says action taken. And this gives a chance in advance of the follow-up meeting to send this action sheet out to everyone and say, could you just give me an update please on the action taken? We'll come back to that in just a moment. And so here we are beginning to present the minutes as they would appear. So first of all, the venue, the time and so on. And now we're getting the body of the minute. And I'm just showing you there how I number, so that I'll have one for the main heading, like finance. And I'll then go to 1.1, or it won't be that because that'll be for the minutes, but 3.1 say, for management accounts. And maybe 3.2 for budget. And it may be then that there's even a subheading to budget. So it could be budget for worship, budget for outreach, in which case I would go 3.2.1, 3.2.2. So it's a simple way down the left-hand column of just dividing up all the matters that were talked about and recorded in the minutes. And so I've talked about a subheading there, and I've also talked about a subheading. Now we go back to the topics discussed. Once the minutes have been taken, you're in the place to be able to put in what were the topics that were discussed. You can't do that in advance. You might think you can by just writing the agenda in there. But do you remember how I said sometimes you cut and paste and move stuff around? Well, the minutes are a record of what has happened and presented in the most helpful way. They are essentially chronological, but there may be some variation. So the topics discussed are just pulling out each of the main headings and the subheadings. I don't actually go to subheadings, but to the main headings and the subheadings, then go into the topics discussed. So going back to the important aids to effectiveness, we've now dealt with the agenda, we've dealt with minutes, and I now want to just take a little bit more of a look at the action sheet. And so you'll remember here that these items are under particular people's names. So here we have the names of Adrian and of Nigel. And then over on that right-hand side, the column action taken. And this is where people put in what action they've taken. Now, how do they do that? I don't want to say, well, we phoned up someone or other and we had a discussion and then had a meeting on such and such a day and then eventually we came to a decision. We don't need all that detail. We just need a very succinct little bit of detail to go in there. And so these are the things I'm looking for. Just the word done. So it means that the action was taken as required, as was requested at the meeting, that the action's been taken. So that action is now done. And then, if necessary, just 2 or 3 words giving a little bit of detail if there's some variation or some particular piece of information that is helpful. Next, in progress. It's quite possible that a particular action will spread across the time scale of 2 or 3 meetings. And so this is a chance just to give a progress report. Or it may be that the action is to hold a series of meetings. And so you can say, well, I met with such and such a person and we decided that we needed someone else in and have another meeting scheduled for, and you give the date. And so this gives a progress to date, and it also gives a chance for them to say, I think that by the end of November, I'll have an answer for you. That then just helps me as chairman, if that's my role, to put it onto the December agenda. to make sure that we've got accountability. So can you see that this is all coming together to try and help make these meetings really effective and work for you? Now, it may be that the action has resulted in something that's in progress, but now needs to come back for some further discussion into the meeting. And so that is put on this action sheet as well. And I or someone can pick it up and put it onto the agenda if time allows. And then there are occasions where the action's not been taken, and so all you do is to put in outstanding and give the reasons for the delay. Now, this action review and the action sheet that we were looking at with the actions done in the right-hand column, I sent that out in advance, maybe a week in advance, to all the members and ask them for some feedback. I give them a date by which I want that feedback. I then combine together, or ask someone to combine together, all those actions, and then recirculate that action list to the meeting before the meeting ever takes place. And that saves a huge amount of time. Because if you're going to go through an action list in the context of the meeting, it can be very time consuming if everyone reports on what was done. But if this action sheet goes out in advance, reporting on paper what has been done, you can take it as read or just make passing reference to particular actions if that is needed. And it means you can turn the follow-up of the previous minute's actions from maybe 15-20 minutes, and accountability is very important, and you can deal with them in less than 5 minutes. And so this is what I mean about making meetings work for you. By doing this simple thing, you can save a lot of people's time. And so it leaves time for quality discussion on agenda items. Well, that's all I want to say about some of those kind of practical administrative matters related to meetings. So we've talked about agendas, we've talked about minutes, we've talked about an action sheet. But I want to just go on now and talk briefly about chairing a meeting, because this also is a real key to making meetings work for you. I chair many meetings, and I just want to give you some of the key issues I feel related to chairing. First of all, to realize what the role of a chairman is. It's as a facilitator. It's to make that meeting work well. It's someone who's looking after the timekeeping and so on. And so it may not be the leader. Very often I have been in meetings where the lead elder, say, has taken the meeting and has chaired it. And in all honesty, that's not his gifting. But there may be someone sitting there who is also an elder who is really gifted at handling groups, understanding group discussion, being able to draw people out. And so it's better to ask someone else to chair the meeting rather than expect the lead elder, just by dint of his position, to take on that chairing role. It has an advantage as well, because it means that he has freedom to speak as much as he wants with the chairman's discipline as appropriate. See, if the lead elder is chairing the meeting, it's very, very easy to dominate. By nature of who he is, he probably has got a lot of very helpful things to contribute to the meeting. And if he's chairing, it's easy to abuse that position of chair and to dominate the meeting. And by doing that, you are negating the valuable contributions from other people. But if he's not chairing the meeting, he has freedom to contribute as much as he wants. And he must have good relationship with everyone there. And so whoever is facilitating or chairing the meeting can then say, look, I think, John, I think you've probably said enough at the moment. Can we just get the views of one or two other people and then come back to you? And it's a way of just keeping the meeting rolling and not becoming just one person speaking and dominating the whole time. Now, planning the meeting is also very, very important. I give serious thought to a meeting before it takes place. I like to picture the meeting in progress and think, okay, even practical things like, what is the best seating? Who is more comfortable in such and such a position, and so on. And so we try to plan the meeting, but then the agenda. We've talked now extensively about agendas. I, as a chairman, would own the agenda, and I will determine the order of events on that agenda. I want to give sufficient time to the really meaty subjects. Things that may be relatively trivial I'll put towards the end of the agenda, which is a time when people are getting tired, and so you don't need to be as alert, perhaps. And so I will order that agenda. I will also think, if a particular item takes longer than I expect, and we don't get to the last couple of items on the agenda, does it matter? So I'll make sure that the end items are able to be removed. Although also during the meeting sometimes I will reshape an agenda because the way that the dynamic of the meeting is going is not quite as I'd anticipated, and I'll realise that there is a need to reshape it to make sure that we do cover all the key items. So thoughtful planning, the venue, the light levels, seating and so on, practical matters, but they make a huge difference to the success of a meeting. Now you may think, the way I've been talking, that this sounds all incredibly heavy and very organised and very administrative. Yes, in a sense that is true, but I would say keep it light. We're friends together when we meet. We're not like the ministers in a government who are stabbing each other in the back so often. No, we're friends together, all moving in the same direction. Let's enjoy doing that. And so there are times when I will quite deliberately throw in a bit of humour. Just very briefly, 30 seconds, give a testimony of something that I've heard recently as a way of just lightening the atmosphere, particularly after quite an intense discussion. It's good just to be prepared to do that. So we want to get the business done, we want to cover the items that are on the agenda, but keep it light, keep it relational. We're a privileged people serving in the kingdom of God, and He doesn't want us to be heavy and dour all the time. Keep it light as much as possible. Now there are certain just protocols that it's good to understand. Our trustee body is actually about 12 people. And so if you have all 12 just free to chip in at any time and make a comment, and then a discussion between two people over here and another discussion between two people over there takes place, the meeting doesn't flow, it becomes disorganized. And so it may be helpful to recognize that people say, look, can I just contribute something looking at me? And I'll say, sure. Or, while someone's talking, they might just alert me to the fact they want to come in and make a contribution. And so that's what I mean by through the chair. That people will make a contribution but recognize that I'm running the meeting and they won't just speak up out of the blue. Now that's in a very formal setting. In other settings, of course, it's just everyone chipping in on the discussion. That would have been an awful way to run a meeting that goes across 3 days. It would just be too constrained and too unfriendly. And so there we would get into a topic and there'll be discussion flowing backwards and forwards, just as in any other conversation. So it's just good to recognise what are the protocols, if any. Is it acceptable just to chip in at any time? Or is it that it does go through the chair? And obviously also that everyone is deferring to the chair when the chair says, okay, I think we've gone far enough on that, now we're moving on. Oh, but I had another thing to say. No, everyone defers to the chair. You trust him, he is chairing because that is his skill and gift. And so you trust him to move the meeting on. knowing the people. This sounds obvious, particularly in our context where we're probably good friends with each other. But what I mean by this is that some people actually don't like a big meeting and they clam up. They don't contribute. Other people are talk all the time. That's just their character. And so it's very important as a chairperson to be able to say, okay, look, I think we've heard enough of that just at the moment. Can you just hold that? Charlie, what do you think? You've been very quiet so far. Have you any thoughts on this? And very often that quiet, reflective person will bring some contribution you think, oh my goodness, I wish we'd heard that earlier. Because that's part of their character, their internal processes. They sit and think, I'm a bit like that myself. And you sit and think, and then when you make a contribution, it's a considered contribution. Whereas other people are external processes. The way they think is by interacting, by talking to other people. That's how they form their thoughts and come to conclusions. And it's important for a chairman to appreciate that and to recognize that, so that those who are being quiet are able to contribute. And you know that we've got the best out of this particular group, because everyone has a contribution to make. That's why they're part of the group. Acceptance. There's nothing more embarrassing, I find, than someone making a contribution and others saying, oh, do you really think that? In other words, they are dismissive of what someone's contributed. And the result of that can be that that person will be very, very reluctant to make another contribution. And so I'll always be very affirming. I'll always say to people, thank you very much, that's a really helpful contribution. And have you got something over here? Or, if it really is a very helpful contribution, even draw them out a bit more. I didn't quite understand what you meant by that. Can you just enlarge on that a little bit? But acceptance is that whatever anyone says is accepted by the whole group. That nothing is dismissed, nothing is rubbished, but you accept it, and then as a chairman, you draw out the best of the best and allow that to take the conversation forward. If someone does make a contribution that, in all honesty, everyone recognises is a bit stupid, and it can happen, you still don't want to show that up. You just handle it well and move on, without making that person feel, oh, I've really blown it and said something stupid. And then it's a skill of a chairman to know really the point at which a discussion has ended. A discussion can go on and on and on, but you don't get very much more light, very much more insight in the latter parts. And so it's important for a chairman to be aware of when I'm not sure that we're gaining any more now, it's become a bit repetitive, and then to say, I think we've probably about dealt with this issue. Can I just summarise? And you'll then summarise the 2 or 3 points. Now, are we all agreed on that? So there's general kind of, agreement. Now, this point just needs an action. Now, who's going to take that? Thank you, George. Thank you, Sally, whoever it is. And that action is then agreed, and we move on, and it's recorded in the minutes by whoever's taking the minutes. So it's important just to recognise when the discussion has ended, and you can do that little bit of summarising. And so here we are. Here is the summary that I've just referred to. What is the action? Who is going to take it? And when is it expected to be dealt with? Then there's one final item that you can put on an agenda. I do this actually very rarely, but just from time to time it's helpful. How did the meeting go? It's good just to allow people to come back in and even be critical of the chairman and say, Nigel, I really think you dominated a bit much there. And I'll say, I'm so sorry, okay, I'll try and do better next time. Or, we're running very tight on time towards the end of the agenda. Can we make that sharper? Or maybe, I think it would have been really helpful if we'd had a paper about that to think about in advance rather than it to be tabled. Can we do that in future? And so you're learning how to make the meeting better, more effective, and more acceptable to everyone who's involved. And so there we are. I hope that's helped you to see that it is possible to make meetings more effective, more fun, more relational. And particularly this last little section that we've dealt with about chairing a meeting, because the chairman actually is a very, very important person in the meeting. He's not just there to make sure everything's covered in the agenda. There are these hidden dynamics that are important to be aware of. So I hope that'll help you as you go forward and get into other meetings.